Well, today is the last Sunday of the church's liturgical year, and it is celebrated as the feast of Christ the King. It's always celebrated on the Sunday prior to the first Sunday of the church's liturgical year, the first Sunday of Advent. And for good reason. It is to remind us all that the child for whom we long during the season of Advent, Emmanuel, is our King. And that his kingdom, his sovereign rule, and his kingly activity is good, and it's just, and it's true. This morning's reading from the Gospel of St. John serves to communicate these points well. Of the four Gospel writers, I'll admit that John is perhaps my favorite, because John, as a writer, is the most animated of the four. Matthew is analytical, Mark is assertive, and Luke is an amiable fellow. But John is animated. He's an artist. He's a right-brained storyteller who's able to draw us into the story of Jesus and then challenge us to consider how that story can speak into our own lives today. Well, this morning's gospel reading recounts the exchange between Pilate and Jesus. And in the hours immediately prior to this exchange, Jesus has already been betrayed by Judas and turned over to the chief priests and the Pharisees, who have questioned him about his teachings. And Simon Peter has been watching from afar, and he's just denied him 3 times. And having been taken to and then questioned by Caiaphas the high priest, Jesus is now delivered, summoned to the praetorium, Pilate's provincial palace there in Jerusalem. And within the walls of that palace, Pilate, the created one, interrogates Jesus, the one through whom all things were made. Now, Pilate has sometimes been portrayed as a poor, unfortunate soul, a bless your heart, if you will, who was asked to do the impossible. He was asked to untangle a knot of troubles that he didn't create. And by untangling that knot, he put to death a well-thought-of man. But according to the most historical accounts of Pilate, he was regarded as an inflexible and cruel and stubborn man. He was a careerist within imperial Rome, and he had aspirations of a more appropriate post somewhere else in the empire, which is why he was in Jerusalem at the time of the Passover. You see, Pilate's primary residence was in the coastal town of Caesarea, where he spent the majority of his year. However, he kept a temporary residence in Jerusalem, only because from there he could ensure that civil order would be maintained during the feasts. And if he could maintain order by whatever means necessary, often by violence, then Pilate could remain confident that his aspirations, his career goals, would not be endangered. So Pilate, the created one, the one who came from Caesarea to Jerusalem for fear and vainglory, stands there before Jesus, the one through whom all things were made, the one for who us and for our salvation came down from heaven. The two could be no more different. Pilate begins the conversation by asking Jesus, "So, are you the king of the Jews?" Which can be rightly interpreted as, "Are you the king of Judea?" Because Pilate's concern was geopolitical. He wanted to know if Jesus, the man who was standing before him, was going to pose a political threat to his rule. If this man standing before him was going to cause chaos and disorder, because he could have none of that, especially if he wanted to go someplace else in the empire. For Pilate, a king exercised coercive power and maintained his rule using military force. But Jesus replies, "Why do you want to know?" Jesus pushes back. He says, "Are you asking because you perceive me as a threat? Or are you asking me these things only because you've been told about me? Pilate becomes indignant. You see, Pilate hated, he despised the Jewish people. Hence his response, I'm not a Jew. I'm not like you, and I'm not like your people. In fact, I have no real regard for you whatsoever. I just want to know why in the world you're standing here before me now. Well, Jesus answers Pilate's question by describing the origin of his kingly power and authority. Jesus says, my kingship is not of this world, and my kingship is very different from yours. Because if my kingship, if my sovereign rule, if my kingly activity were of this world, I would most certainly have an army that would be fighting to prevent my capture by the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this world. Jesus' response is unequivocal. His kingdom, his kingship, is not dependent upon this world, nor is its exercise dependent upon military might, but instead his kingdom and the effects of his kingdom within this world comes from beyond this world. His kingdom and authority come from God and will therefore have no end. There seems to be a glimmer of hope when Pilate answers him, responds to him, and says, so you are a king. To which Jesus replies, not sarcastically, you're correct to say that I'm a king, because I've been born and I've come into the world to bear witness to the truth, and those who love the truth will recognize that what I'm saying is true. So what does this exchange have to do with us today? How does what happened between those two men within those walls, what effect does it have? And what does it have to offer us? Well, I believe it offers us two things primarily. The first thing that the kingship of Jesus affords us is a proper perspective. And if there's anything we need most in this world, it's a proper perspective. On November 9th of next year, we will have elected a new president. And after a contentious battle, and after the billionth dollar has been spent, and after the last promise has been made and broken, we'll have a new president. But we have a proper perspective because Jesus is our king. And I'm quite confident that on that morning, Jesus will still be enthroned and his kingdom will continue to have no end. The second thing that Jesus' kingship affords us is the opportunity to entrust ourselves to him. You see, the people in Pilate's care did not trust him because he only had his selfish ambition to guide him. His power and his authority originated with men, and therefore it would end with men. But Jesus, who is our King, who is a King of love and peace and truth and justice, he's trustworthy. Because instead of coming from a coastal town to make sure we didn't become unruly, Jesus came from heaven to give us life and life to the fullest so that we may be unruly for all the right reasons. Pilate summoned Jesus into his home and demanded that he be there. But if we read on in this morning's gospel, we see that Jesus is sent away. The opportunity Jesus' kingship affords us is to entrust ourselves to him and to invite him into our homes, our lives, and have him stay. And not only stay, but to be enthroned and to have access to all things because he is trustworthy. Today marks the anniversary of C.S. Lewis's death. The Oxford scholar, the author of the Chronicles of Narnia, Mere Christianity, most any book I could name you'd recognize. And in Mere Christianity, he speaks of this enthronement in the hearts of men and women, of those who are willing to entrust themselves to Jesus, to invite him into their homes. And I want to close with this, reading from him. Imagine yourself as a living house. God comes in to rebuild that house. And at first, perhaps, you can understand what he's doing. He's getting the drains right and stopping the leaks in the roof and so on. You knew that those jobs needed doing, and so you're not too surprised. But presently, he starts knocking the house about in a way that hurts abominably and does not seem to make any sense. So what on earth is he up to? The explanation is that he is building quite a different house from the one you thought of. Throwing out a new wing here, putting on an extra floor there, running up towers, making courtyards. We thought, that we were being made into a decent little cottage. But he is building a palace, and he intends to come as our king and live in it himself. Amen.